There are a lot of different story threads that we thought might work, but the thing is, if you start making it about more stuff, you lose the actual core story. I've got to say, Marc's great at giving those really motivational speeches. It's kind of that authenticity that you love in a documentary. Sometimes the absence of sound is actually more impactful than the sound itself. And the ending was probably the toughest part to cut. I think the first pass that I did on it, it was a bit too sad. I hope that even people who aren't necessarily fans of Newcastle can come away from it feeling something. Hi guys, welcome back. So for those of you who follow me on social media, you will have seen me teasing the release of a new basketball documentary focusing on the Newcastle Eagles called Soaring into History: From Newcastle to a European Final Four. It was produced and filmed by Jamie Thomas from SLB and edited by myself, so I wanted to give you a bit more of an insight into some of the thought processes I had behind putting this thing together. Before I go into any detail, I'm going to say pause this right here, go away and watch the documentary if you haven't already, and then come back. It's well worth a watch, and I hope you will enjoy it. So let's start from the beginning. How did this all come about? Back in March, Jamie reached out to me about the idea of covering the Newcastle Eagles, who had just made the European North Basketball League Final Four. The initial plan was to actually have myself and Jamie both go out to Slovakia. Unfortunately, due to logistics, that didn't end up happening. There were a lot of different story threads that we thought might work, but I think with making a documentary, sometimes the story can reveal itself after the events have happened. So by the time the footage came to me, I really had a lot to pick from and a lot to kind of chop down and kind of mold everything into a more straightforward story. I mean, looking back, there are things that I kind of wish I was able to go into more detail about, but the thing is, if you start making it about more stuff, you lose the actual core story about them going to a European final. So with the intro, you might notice Marc mentioning these 5 or 6 words. That was his description of Newcastle summed up. And I thought that was a really nice way to kick things off because it immediately gives you an idea of what Newcastle is about and also what he is about. Marc, for me, was kind of the central character in the film, and he was the one I kind of wanted to build everything around because not only is he the head coach, but also he understands the city and what it means to the fans. So the flashback to the season previous, in which they lost to Back and Bears, we did ask them a lot more about this, and I did wonder when I was cutting it if we have a whole nother section on this. Because not only did you have the story of a British men's team making a European final, you now also had a redemption arc. Back and Bears ended up being the team that Newcastle beat to make the European North Basketball League Final Four. So there's a whole nother story there, and I think maybe if we had more time, that could have been something we went into more detail about, but it's not the main focus. The main focus is the fact that it's the first time that a British men's team has made a European final. So by that point in the documentary, we've kind of set the scene, and then I thought the viewers still need to understand what kind of a club Newcastle is. So I went back through Newcastle Eagles' archive of videos on their YouTube channel and found so many records of them winning championships because, for those that don't know, Newcastle absolutely dominated for about 20 years in British basketball. Another part that I would love to have gone into more detail about was the whole story around Darius Defoe being a part of all of those titles and now being at a huge point in the club's history. So that tied nicely into the fact that in 2025, Newcastle won the SLB trophy, and it just kind of set the stage nicely that this is a team who are on the rise and they're going into the first ever European final. Now, one of the best bits that Jamie got while he was out there was the locker room speeches that Marc did. I've got to say, Marc's great at giving those really motivational speeches. It's kind of that authenticity that you love in a documentary. We didn't want the whole thing to just be talking heads with cuts back and from the actual gameplay. We wanted to hear what they're saying at the game. I've got to say, Marc gave probably the best line in his interview where he was like, "This is everything." And the way he looks down when he says it, I'm just like, that's so cool. Exactly what we needed to kind of really set up the magnitude of this game, because arguably the semi-final was more important than the final, because if they didn't win the semi-final, there was no getting to the final. Obviously in the semi-final, Newcastle blitz out the gates, have an amazing first quarter, and then kind of slow down towards half-time. The clip of Josh Ward-Hibbert going into the timeout and talking to the team, that actually was from the broadcast, and I have to give props to the European North Basketball League for being able to cover the game so well, having those mics in the timeouts just gives so much more insight into what's going on. For the purposes of this documentary, it gave us an insight into the sort of person Josh is. We hadn't really talked about any of the teammates, and so I thought this was a great point to actually highlight what kind of a person Josh is and what kind of a leader and hard worker he is. So since we asked everyone a lot about the fan base, I really did want to dedicate a whole section to talking about exactly what kind of a club Newcastle is and just why the fans are so important. I was thinking I was going to have sound bites from everybody and flashes to the fans at the various games. It turns out Marc spoke very well, and he mentioned a fan in particular that I just felt was a really nice story to include. Newcastle were really helpful in sending us the pictures of Marc with the fans, so thank you to them for doing that. It just adds a whole level of kind of authenticity. I keep saying it, but that's just something that really helps a documentary and gets people who may not know anything about Newcastle to come away with something from this. I really do like that section. I really like the drone shot kind of flying into the arena that was provided to us by Matchroom Boxing, so thank you to them. Then, of course, we headed into the final. Now, this time, I didn't want to do the lead up into the jump ball the same way that I'd done for the semi-final. We had another locker room speech. We could only really get it from one angle. So I thought, okay, we've got to do this in a different way. What I found was it was actually really nice to hear Marc's voice over the top of them warming up and their kind of faces just focused, locked in. And again, Marc's speech is just, it's awesome. One thing I learned working with editors when I was a EuroLeague AP is sometimes the absence of sound is actually more impactful than the sound itself. So just hearing the music and Marc's voiceover, I felt really worked well for that. Once again in the game, we were able to highlight one of the players. This time it was Darius Defoe. So I kind of got that story thread of Darius Defoe in there being a key part of the club. The hardest part about this bit was trying to tell the story of Newcastle slowly slipping away from CSO Voluntari. Because for anyone that's watched a basketball game, it's never quite as clear cut as that was the defining moment that things slipped away. But they did mention a player on the other team, Kathy, who had a great game, ended up being the MVP of the tournament. So that helped me in terms of editing have a singular focus on what the opposition actually was. Yes, there were other players on the CSO Voluntari team, and there were some really talented guys, but it just helped that we had one guy that the viewers can know by name and just see how good he is, and they can say, okay, so he's the guy they're trying to stop. It was very close. The final score really didn't reflect how close that game was. But sadly for Newcastle, it wasn't to be, and we were able to show the real raw emotion of Marc and the team after that game. I remember Jamie messaging me being really gutted about the team's loss, and I was watching it as well. And, it was a real shame, but, as an editor, I was kind of thinking there is still a way we can tell this story. And so much of it was going to come down to how we actually finish it. Now, the ending was probably the toughest part to cut because I think the first pass that I did on it, it was a bit too sad. There wasn't enough of an uplifting message at the end, and it was just kind of almost like this heartbreaking ending, and then that was it. At the moment where Darius turns to the trophy, and he's just like, that's a big trophy though. That then flips for the audience, it being a sad moment into being kind of a funny moment. And in the end, I think we really kind of found the balance of having this kind of heartbreaking ending, but then also kind of leaving fans with a sense of optimism and kind of hope for the future. The last part with the text on screen over the photos, the text was very much Jamie's idea, so I appreciate him for finding the words to kind of describe the moment. And then the best part that I happened to find quite late in the editing process was the shot of the fans back home that we hadn't really talked about. I think there was only one point in the documentary where Drew mentions the Newcastle Eagles watch party. And it was nice to be able to end on that because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. It's about what it means to the fans. And it's the fans that are watching this, and it's their team that have gone out and done this. And it's also nice because in terms of the context of the documentary, once they finished in that tournament, that's where they were going back to. So it's really cool that we got to use both of those news stories from ITV and BBC. And yeah, that kind of wrapped up the whole thing. We had a few versions of it with a couple of minor tweaks, but the feedback was really great from the guys at Newcastle. And then once we'd finished it, I had no idea they were going to go and do a whole premiere event. I'll admit the whole thing became a lot bigger than I ever thought it was going to be. They had a premiere with the guys that featured in the documentary. All the fans could go and watch it. It was even featured on a BBC Sport news segment. So I've got to say, on the whole experience of making this was just amazing for me. As somebody, again, who really enjoys the kind of storytelling part of making content, this was just an amazing opportunity. I would love to do another documentary in the future. I don't know if I will, but I feel like there's more stories to be told. We'll see what happens, but I really hope people enjoy it. And I hope that even people who aren't necessarily fans of Newcastle can come away from it feeling something. Once again, I want to thank Jamie Thomas for having me on board for this project, and thank you to the Newcastle Eagles, who have been very accommodating and great at promoting the project. And also congrats on their European North Basketball League campaign. I mean, it was amazing, and I wish them nothing but the best for the season ahead. If you've had a chance to watch the documentary, do let me know what you think, and feel free to subscribe for more content in the future. But that is it from me. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.